Welcome to Getting Ready for a Grant. This is the first in a three-part series under the title The Art of Grants. In this series we will also cover writing a compelling grant application and managing your funded project. Here's a fact for you. 54% of applicants pull out of the application before pressing the submit button. Could be for a number of reasons, such as running out of time, or not being able to get the quotes that's needed to attach to the application. Or it could be quite simply that they weren't eligible and didn't check before they started. Or it could be that the project itself isn't eligible. But before we start, let me introduce myself. My name is Pat Gross, and for over 30 years I've been in funding associated positions on both sides of the fence, and I have had the opportunity to do this both in the UK and in Australia. I've taken clients from $0 to $1 million plus in a time frame of 18 months. I remember talking at one event to somebody about this client that we'd worked with over a period of 18 months, and another one piped up and said, yeah, that was us. And I realised that we had actually done two at the same time. We work with both large and small organisations, not-for-profits and businesses, to access grants and to build their profile. I've actually been involved and written a funding criteria and the assessment processes, including a £10 million training fund 20 years ago. So you can imagine how much that would be worth today. And I've designed and delivered professional development for strategic planning, grant writing, project management and project evaluation. This is for you if you want to know how grants work so that you can plan ahead, or if you're looking to make a difference in your community or grow your business, which of course is a geography of interest, or if you want to prepare for those questions you're likely to be asked. Firstly, I want you to take some time to consider why. Explore the why. Why does a grant seem like a good idea to you? Here are some options. You may be looking funding to address a desperate need that can't wait, or to keep people employed, or to support a strategy or goal, or to build the capability of your organisation, committee, staff, volunteers, board, or for equipment or capital works, or to fund a project that will make a difference. Let's go through these and unpack them in detail. So, for instance, if you're going to address a desperate need that can't wait, there's a little bit of a question mark here, because when you apply for a grant, most of the time you may have to wait, first of all, for the grant closing date, which may be within a 4 to 6 week period of it opening, then an additional amount of time to go through processes which we will explain more thoroughly in the third module of about assessment and deciding which projects get funded. So if your project is desperate, then you have to decide how quickly you need the money and if it's worth taking the risk waiting to see whether you're successful or not. Because there are other ways to get funding. You can get a loan. There might be another funder that can turn your application around in a faster time. Or you could go out there and do a GoFundMe kind of exercise just to get contributions and donations in. So there is different ways to bring in the funding, and you have to decide whether you've got the time frame to wait to see if you're successful to get a grant. But then if you look at it another way, to address a desperate need that can't wait, you've probably got a really good argument for a grant. So if the timing's good, then hey, go for it, because you probably will be able to articulate that need, and it's not just a wishy-washy, obviously something we would like to do. If you put your passion and your evidence into the application, then you've got more chance of being successful. The second one, to keep people employed. This is a bit of a no-no in some ways. because grants are not for recurrent employment. Unless it's like a project position, where that project position is dependent on projects, of course, and this is a project that's going to fill some available time, then yes, that will prevail. But if it's just sort of you've got some great staff, you've used them over it maybe a period for a couple of years on a project, and the project's coming to an end, and you want to keep them employed, yes, that's a really good promise from an organisation and validation of the competence of the people who are employed, but you cannot guarantee employment because these are project positions, and therefore they need to have a contract in place that shows the beginning and the end of their employment term. Third is to support a strategy or goal. And to be honest with you, if you've got a strategic plan or some kind of planning that you've done, research, then that is something that's really invaluable when you're actually applying for a grant. So that one is actually a really strong, a strong reason, a strong rationale for applying for funding. As is building the capability of your organisation, your committee, your staff, your volunteers. There are capacity building grants out there that recognise the value of the organisation infrastructure and how that infrastructure needs to be built on to stay ahead of the times. You could be applying for equipment on capital works, and there is funding out there for both not-for-profits and for growth businesses, particularly in the business area where those growth businesses can guarantee jobs. JOBS. It's only 4 letters, but it means a lot when it comes to applying for funding if you're a business. And then to fund a project that will make a difference. Well, that is key because grants are about change. Change is about making a difference. Now let's have a look at what a grant will mean for you. Well, firstly, a grant must align to your mission, strategic goals and priorities. Because, as you say, if it's not in your strategic plan, why do it? And so often I've come across grants which have been for projects or activities that have been left afield. They've not been core to the organisation, and they're the ones that suddenly you find there's running into problems because they may be draining resources from the main activities of the organisation, or they find themselves adrift because the organisation realigns itself and has a look and goes, why are we doing this? So it's very important for security of the project to make sure that whatever you're doing aligns to your mission, your strategic goals and your priorities. The next consideration for a grant and what it will mean for you is it has to be spent as you say it will. It's not a donation for general activities. You have to be accountable. At the end of the project, you have to demonstrate that you've spent the money, that you've achieved the outcomes. So it's important that the budget is allocated and used according to what you said you would use it for in the grant application. You need to have good project management and communication capability. If you can't manage a project, it's not going to work, you're going to fail. If you fail, it doesn't look well on the organisation, and it certainly has a negative impact on your ability to apply for funding in the future. So always make sure that when you are applying for a grant that you've got a good project manager in place. Someone who's got the experience, the skills, the knowledge, the know-how, and the evidence to prove it. You must be able to monitor and manage risks. If you think about it before you even apply, there are things that can go wrong. that would have a disastrous or could have a disastrous impact on your organization. And that's the last thing you want. So when you're putting together an application, consider those risks and how you might address them should they arise. There's implications for human resources on the ground, especially if you are successful with large grants. I have an example of a small organisation managed with a good volunteer input, 2 part-time staff, and they were working at that level. They progressed and they got a large amount of income, grant income, and they were able to deliver a large project, which meant that they needed more professional staff, more staff. That actually then changed the culture of the organisation, and also the board needed to upskill itself in terms of human resource management, policies, regulations, etc., for working with a larger number of staff. So when you do get a grant, make sure that you can actually, from the inside of the organisation, govern your processes so that you can manage an influx of resources. A grant, I just mentioned this earlier, does influence what you do and what you prioritise. If you end up with a big grant, it can take away from the other activities in your organisation. Likewise, what you do could be governed by your ability to access grants, and therefore you're tied to the grants and the projects that are associated with them, rather than being growing your organisation strategically. So you're spending too much time in the organisation, in the everyday activities, doing something that is not going to add a lot of value to your future sustainability. And of course, a grant will raise your profile. So make sure that you do come over as being more professional, more inclusive, and to show that you are, I would say worthy, but to show that you are a serious player. The most prolific reason why applications are abandoned is because whoever started to write the application didn't check to see whether the organisation was eligible for the grant in the first place. The guidelines for grants stipulate what kind of organisation structures are eligible. And in Australia, this is a choice of some of the major structures. So you could be an unincorporated community group. Now, because you're not a legal entity, you may need to be auspiced by an organisation that is incorporated. And that means that the auspice organisation will take responsibility on your behalf for making sure that the project gets delivered and the funds get spent. The money will be allocated to you through the auspice organisation, but the contract will be between the auspice and the funder. Incorporated association, not-for-profits may be incorporated. There are other structures as well, but that just means that you are a legal entity and you're a not-for-profit and you're an association. A public limited company, that's again, it's a not-for-profit that's set up as in a company-like structure, but the profits go back into the organisation. They're not allocated to shareholders. That's the difference between a public limited company and a private limited company. An incorporated association or an incorporated organisation may have charity status, and they would have to apply to the Charity Commission to become a charity. At an even deeper level, the charity or an organisation similar may have deductible gift recipient status, and this goes into the area of benevolence. And if you are dealing with your main purpose is benevolence, then you will be looking for donations, and that means that people and organisations that donate to your organisation, if you've got DGR status, will be able to claim that money back on their tax. So that's what deductible gift recipient status means. then you may be a private business. Or in some cases, there are a few, but not a lot of grant options for individuals. Do you need an auspice or a partner? Now, there's a big distinction between auspicing and partnerships. If you're in an unincorporated community group and you require a legal entity to take responsibility on your behalf with the funding body, then they are an auspice, and you need an auspice organisation. But if you are incorporated and you're looking for an organisation to work with, or they can apply for the grant because it may be certain kinds of organisations and you just don't happen to be that kind of organisation, but you want to work with somebody, then you may be a partner with them. There's a difference. Because they are incorporated, they are a partner. Or it could be that you want access to a grant where the requirement is for DGR recipients only. So then you could again either be auspiced by a DGR legal entity if you're in an unincorporated group, or you could be working in partnership with the DGR entity. Here is the not-so-secret formula to get ready for when the grants come along. When you find a grant to apply for and you've only got a 4 to 6 week window, if that, how do you prepare in advance so that you're well prepared and you can spend that time on those finishing touches? In this workshop, we will cover how to translate your idea into a ready-to-go project so that when a grant comes along, you can apply with confidence. And it comprises 1. Identifying the need, developing the project concept and scoping the project timeline and activities. This is the business case. Number 2. Collaborating and consulting with community and partners. Number 3. Where to look to find out what is available, including the basic rationale for grants. And number 4. Matching the project concept with potential grants. What to look for first to make sure the project is aligned with what the funder wants. A good grant application, after all, is in fact a good business case. Therefore, why not prepare a business case for your bright idea before the grant possibility comes around? And this is a list of what you should be including in your preparatory business case. First of all, start with the rationale. Why is there a need for this project? What's going on out there that drives the need or the urgency? In this rationale, you'll be looking at, well, what change do we want to effect? What would happen if we didn't have this project? Would things get worse? Would our business survive? Would the problems in the community exacerbate? These are some of the considerations you should have around the rationale, and when you're preparing the rationale, also think about gathering the evidence that you need, which can be the primary evidence from the people concerned or who are going to be a benefit from this, who are going through the issues. It could be secondary information, which is all the data which we touched on in the last slide. The second area that you start looking at is the project plan. In other words, how you're going to organise and deliver the project. And there's 2 components here. The first component is who's going to run it? Who's your project manager? Who are your project staff? The second element, and most important, is what you're going to do step by step. And as you unpack what you think you want to do, also consider as you go along how much time is going to do, or each stage is going to take, and the people and the physical resources that you're probably going to need as part of this project. So what you're basically doing is you're starting to think about the budget. But if you also work out the project, you're also being fair to the project that gets funded, because you've actually scaled and thought about all the different activities. Therefore, you will be able to then create a realistic budget, which means that you will be able to deliver everything you said you'd deliver. If you don't do that, you run the risk of just guessing how much the project will cost and not really understanding, so that when you get the money, you're going to find that you're going to have a delay in getting the staff that you need. You probably don't need the right staffing or volunteers, or you haven't got them because you've not thought about it beforehand. You can't afford the salaries. There's extra costs in there that you hadn't thought about. There may be a step in the process, for instance, later on you might do, and we come across risk analysis here, but one of the risks could be that people are not interested. So you probably would need to build in an additional task in your project, which is about engaging the community or engaging the market, doing some marketing. So once you start to plan out the components of the project, you get a well-rounded and realistic impression of what is actually going to work. The next area is your capability. Now that is about your history, your ability. How can you prove that you can look after somebody else's money? So your capability goes right to the top on your ability to manage the contract with the funder. Who's responsible at that level? Do they have the right business acumen, understanding? Do you have the right insurances in place? Look through the contractual agreement, which will come into the third module, third workshop, and have a look at those components and make sure that you have actually got the capability. Another area you could be looking at is, do you have the capability, especially if it's going to be a big project, do you have the skills and expertise to be able to manage the resources involved with a large project? Once you've gone through that, then another consideration is, what are the success factors? How will you know you've been successful? How do you measure that? That's a good thing to think about before you even start a project, because then you can collect information about where people are at, where the situation is at the beginning, and then be able to build in under each milestone some way of testing the change. And then again at the end, it's better to do that progressively than it is to look from the end of the project and try and gather the evidence of how do you know you've been successful in terms of the change, social change, those kind of factors. I mean, things like, increasing revenue and profitability, they're sort of quite easy to be able to benchmark. But in terms of how people change and opinions, etc., then that needs to be built in right from the beginning. And in this case, we're thinking about it before we even get to that point of having an application for funding. Risks is something else that you need to consider. I mentioned that if you actually start right now and think about, well, what could go wrong with this project, then you can build in risk factors or things that can alleviate and mitigate that from happening. As I mentioned, you're not getting engagement. That could be a high risk. Therefore, you would think about, okay, so what we need to do is add an element here about engaging the market or engaging the community. Another high risk may be that the project manager, you put all the responsibility on the project manager, who then for some reason leaves. So you would start thinking about, okay, so we need a good communication structure here, a good reporting structure. So you build that into your project plan. And finally, the most important in many ways is the resources, the financial resources. What kind of resources are you going to need? And maybe the resources would be for buying equipment, materials, maybe for employing staff. It could be for engaging contractors, specialists, etc. So in your building your business case, you really need to think about what it will cost to deliver this project, and you've got a good indication there of the kind of money that you're looking for. One of the things that you would be considering is, it's so easy to say, okay, we'll look for a grant for this, but I would say stop. Consider all avenues of potential income to help pay for the cost of your project activity. It could be a loan. It could be other ways. I mean, you might want to do it all by volunteers. That's fine. It could be you could afford to pay for it yourself. It's a business case. We're not talking about grant here. You could do you could have a business case for anything, and therefore because it works on the same principles. But certainly, if you've got an indication of how much the project is going to cost, be realistic, of course. Cost realistic prices. Do not ever consider working on the smell of an oily rag. It doesn't do you any justice if you apply for a grant, get the money, and you find that the money doesn't go far enough because the quality of what you deliver will be minimal. And it doesn't help because it gives the wrong signals to funders, who are basically out there and they think that you can deliver this thing for next to nothing. When the reality is that you really need to be fair to your organisation in order to be able to achieve an outcome that's going to deliver the results that you're looking for. Fundamental to any business case is to identify the need. Why do you need to do this activity? It might be something that you think is a good idea, but if it's not going to get supported at any level, then it could even be like the beneficiary that you're thinking is going to benefit from this, or the target customer. And if you haven't done your research, you could be putting a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of effort into something that is not going to go anywhere. So I talk about the concept of peeling an onion, and this is what used to happen when I was working in a government role. Somebody would contact me, I can remember this particular conversation, and she says, I've got this idea, can you would it work? So she started to tell me, and it was more like one of those nice to haves. There's no real substance when it comes to need. So I asked her, well, okay, so what's the need? And she said, oh, blah. And I said, no, what's the need? And we ended up going further and further into what I would call the onion. Each layer that we would then peel off until we got to the pain, and that was the real need, the real crux of the argument, what was really going on for the need for this project. Once we identified that gave us some clarity, and the client was then able to go out there and find the evidence to justify what the problem was. Once she was clear what the heart of the problem was, the heart of the onion, then she was able to go out there and do something about it. So, for example, these are the sort of ways that you can actually find to justify your argument. External data. There's all sorts of information out there. There could be economic data, there could be social data, census data in particular, that's available. You can find that from census websites, or you could go somewhere like your local government will have plans which include data specific to that area. So it's important to be able to identify the figures. The figures, and it could be for anything. It could be like, for instance, the number of suicides in Australia in 2021, as specific as that. It's good to be able to, in any business case, use numbers. Stories and numbers. Numbers could be figures or it could be a percentage. If you can use those, you're beginning to determine for somebody who's reading your argument, you're giving them some benchmarks to work from. So always consider including external data. Then you've got government policy and plans, including local plans. I say that if there's an application form and the guidelines refer to a policy statement or a plan, it doesn't have to be government, it can be anything that's relating to the funder. It might be some research that's being done on behalf of a philanthropic foundation. Always sort of read that information, get some information from them, and be able to use that again as part of your argument for the business case. The reason I've included local councils is because most projects are geographic in nature, and therefore if you can refer to your local council, they've got plans, they've got economic plans, they've got social health and social plans, health and welfare plans, they've got environmental plans. You can refer to those plans, and if you can find information that correlates with what you want to do, it adds value to your business case because it's determining that there's also local support or local need, identification of need, to justify your argument. Then we move on to research and in general, and we find that I find that the research, people tend to include the information about the researchers and the dates, etc. If you're limited for word count, this can take up some valuable space. So yes, refer to the research, but keep it to the minimum in terms of if you reference and who you reference. At the end of the day, you want to be able to get as strong as argument as you possibly can over to the reader. It's good to show that the research has discovered this, but you really don't need to go chapter and verse into who the researchers were, etc. Internal data and feedback. Internally, there's a lot of information that you probably hadn't even thought about. Could be participation, especially if you're wanting to increase number of people taking part in programs in your organisation. There is data in your organisation itself. Use it, and then finally, evaluation and stakeholder feedback. Stakeholder feedback is evidence from if you're doing business, if it's marketing, yes, go and talk to your market base and get their feedback. If it's a community project, then you're talking to community leaders or even the actual intended beneficiaries themselves. And if it's and then I'll give you a good example. African youth, looking for examples from African youth. Client actually, there was nothing specific in terms of what their needs were, what their thoughts were, but they were getting a bad reputation in the press because of gang warfare. So my client actually went out with a series of questions and found 267, and those 267 their data was put into a notebook, which I transcribed. We used that as evidence, and then that information was also supplied to the funder because they did not have access to that kind of funding. And then, of course, evaluation of all your project activity and programs, especially if you're thinking of doing the next stage. Then you can show that this is what's the outcomes, this is what's been determined, this is where the gaps are, this is what people have said from these projects. And if you can gather that evidence, you're building up a good, strong argument for the next step. Funders like to see community involvement, and that could be a community, a geographic community, community of interest, or a business community. Whatever it is, there has to be evidence of community involvement. And there are a few ways you can do this. Well, first of all, when you're identifying the need for the project, have a look for gaps in service provision, and also look at what's already happening. There could be duplication anyway with what you want to do, or there could be other service providers or businesses out there that you may want to partner with because there are synergies, and that working together will empower and give that project the extra oomph to lift it off the page. It's important to work to strengths and participation of the community partners. The word there is strengths and participation. Strengths that you both, or how many of you there are in this partnership approach, that you bring the individual strengths that complement each other, that no one organisation or a business could do in its own right. Also, participation is extremely important because it's not about ticking the numbers, just ticking a box and saying we've got 2 or 3 community partners or business partners because this is a requirement of the funding, but all they're really going to do is come to a meeting once a month and be updated on what we're doing. That's not the way it works. A partner to any project is bringing those individual resources, strengths, expertise, and that should be reflected all the way. It should be reflected in the project plan, and if you do the project plan intricately enough, you'll be able to identify the individual roles of the community partners and how they will best service and support your project. It's very important to get them involved from the start of the process where possible. So when you're putting together the project plan, for example, they should be involved in putting together that plan, because they will have their own thinking and their own experiences that they can bring to enrich this project plan. And also, because they've been involved in the development of the plan, they have some ownership of how the project rolls out. So there should never be an afterthought. Sometimes it does happen like that when you get so far into planning a project and you realize that you haven't got all the skills. It's not something you can engage or a consultant or a person to do, employ somebody. It may be that there's another organisation who has got those skills that you can invite them to be part of your project. And as part of the whole application process, it's important that the partners are able to put together, or the potential partners are able to put together letters of intent. Not so much letters of support, but letters of intent. Because by using the word intent in the argument, in the text, in the letter, it's all about how they intend to be part of the project. It's also easier to use the words letters of intent than having a formal memorandum of understanding pre-produced. Some funders have gone as far as saying we want to see an MOU between the project partners, and that's led to some difficulties. But putting together a letter of intent with some of the conditions of the MOU, but not binding them in such a way that if they don't get the project, that's fine. But if they do get they get funded, there may be some things that needed to be ironed out. Plus the fact that to put together an MOU before applying for the grant and the deadline means you're not really thinking through how the whole process will work. So it's easier to put together an intent. These are what we want to cover when we're working together, and then to really get things happening at the point that they get funding. Otherwise, they put a lot of effort into this and they may not get funded anyway. Then there's letters of support. So if you've got community consultation happening, which is imperative wherever possible, because there's two ways of looking at this. Is you can do a project for the community, or you can do a project to the community. If you haven't consulted with the community and you don't really know what's going on, and you really don't know who the key players are, and you haven't engaged those key players and got them emotionally involved in your project, then you're going to be doing the project to them. But if you have got them involved, they are able to come forward and to contribute their issues, their problems, the very same issues and problems that you've identified in your scoping, then they're giving some very, very strong support to your application. Do not fall into the trap of creating standard letters, sending them out to various community groups and asking them to just copy, paste and sign off. The best letters of support are the ones that really come from, this is the need within our community, this is what we've experienced. I remember putting together a package of letters of support for a project. There was 27 pages, and all of those letters of support were individual, and they included a lot of data that we could enrich the application form with. And needless to say, that project was funded. It would have been extremely difficult to argue if there was no community support. And this includes the evidence of consultation. And one example was the gentleman who wanted to work with a group of youth, a cohort of youth. There'd been no actual consultation with them. There's been consultation with elders in the community leaders, but even that was not substantial. But there'd been lots of complaints in the press and news articles, and even on the news about these young people. But what we did was put together a series of questions. The organisation went out and found those people and came back with a comprehensive survey instrument that had been completed with well over 260 of the target market, basically the people that we're trying to reach. And we created a report which was used as part of the application, and it was added to the application as strong evidence of the consultation. Not with there was consultation with the people around, the influencers, the seniors in the community, But this was direct consultation with the people that the project wanted to reach and assist. So you've identified the need, and you've found some potential community partners, you've done your consultation with the community. So where do you start looking? Well, here is a quick analysis of where you look. There will be funding, government funding at federal, state and in your local government area. And the level of funding relates to the priorities at that level. And for each of those funding levels, there will be a plan, a policy. There's a framework, because the funding is the financial instrument to operationalize and to get things happening for policy outcomes at the higher level, or planning outcomes at the higher level. If you take it like this, that the government has got the resources, as in the financial resources, to achieve some outcomes that it wants to achieve, that set out to achieve, but they do not have the resources on the ground. You have the resources on the ground, and so do others. So what you are doing is you are pitching in under a process to be able to buy into some of the financial resources, or buy into to acquire some of the financial resources to carry out projects and activities that's going to contribute to the outcomes that they're looking for. Now, if you're looking for funding from your federal, state or local government, the best place you can look is online. If you look at the federal government, there will be business grants, there will be community grants. The same with state governments, and each state government has its own website dedicated to grants. And again, in your local council, most local councils focus on community grants. Some, but not the majority, it is the minority, will also have grants available for businesses. If you're a business, more often than not, you'll be looking to state and federal funding. But in some lucky areas where local government has a focus on attracting and growing local business, then there's potential for some grants. And then another example of an area you can be looking is in philanthropic trusts and foundations. And they're there for the not-for-profit sector, for charities, and if you dig deep into some of these philanthropics, they will be looking at organisations that are charities with deductible gift recipient status, DGR. If you're wondering what DGR is, then it's every possibility that you don't have it, so don't worry about it. DGR we're more often serving the benevolence in the community, and therefore there is special exemptions in for tax purposes for people making donations. So if you've got DGR1 status, that's the most common DGR status, and that's where the really charitable of the charities have got access to that level. And philanthropic trusts will go to, there are a few that will actually fund not-for-profits as they are. There are a second level that will fund charities, and then there are a deeper level that will fund only if you've got DGR status. When you're looking for a grant, you can look for grants that are open on a regular basis. So a grant may open 3 or 4 times a year or annually. And if you find those grants, then my recommendation is that you sign up to their online newsletter service so that you can be alerted to when the next round is open. When you find a grant that you're looking for, Look, go straight to the guidelines. First of all, check to see if you're eligible to apply. And if you're not, either partner with somebody who is, or don't even bother looking beyond that, because you will not be eligible, and therefore any application will be rejected. But if you are eligible and what you want to do is eligible, then go straight to the aims, objectives and outcomes. If you can find them, well, you'll at least be able to find the outcomes in the guidelines document. Highlight them and focus on them. When you're answering your questions, focus on those. This is what you are responding to, not what you want to do, but on what you want to do will help them to achieve their aims, objectives and outcomes. And the other thing you need to do is to look for the total pool size if it is available. So if there is only $1 million worth of funding in the grant and you can apply for up to $50,000, you know that's not going to go a long way, especially if the grant is open to a wide geographic area. So you know that it's going to be very competitive, and therefore you question whether it's worth applying. There are other grants that could be open for millions of dollars. Again, just check the maximum that can be applied for and then work that out as well. So there's quite a bit that you can be looking for. And another piece of advice in Australia is, if you are not applying on a regular basis, you're just wanting to see what grants are available, there is a service that's through a website called Grant Guru, which if you key in your nearest geographic location and then Grant Finder afterwards, you'll get an access to the database, which is free for casual users. Just sign up, but that's something that you might want to do. That's as of this presentation. That may change in the future. But that's one, if you're just looking casually to see what grants are available, then you can look that one up. Otherwise, if you're becoming a regular subscriber to grants, then there are paid subscription services, and it's worth signing up to those services because it saves you a lot of time tracking down available funding on a regular basis. Here is the big secret to being able to write a killer application. I've mentioned this before and I repeat it again. It's all about what you do helps the funder to achieve their objectives and outcomes. Once you realize this means that you can pitch your argument and your proposal to achieving their objectives and outcomes. You'll achieve yours, but they will align to what the funder is looking for. Here's a quick analysis of how grants work. Somewhere, this is in the government domain, but somewhere in the background there is a policy. There's a big picture. It's a policy, it could be an action plan, there's going to be a framework with the outcomes overall that the funder is looking for. The policy will look to a strategic or an action plan, or you just may be informed of a strategic plan or an action plan. And in the action plan you will find some data. The data that was used in order to put together the action/strategic plan. What's going on in the world, and if you know that, then this is great, especially when you're looking at local council grants and also looking at council documents, because it doesn't matter if you're looking at a grant for your local area or you're applying to a state or federal grant. because where your delivery is going to take place is within a local council area. And therefore, if you're applying to whoever, you can look at those local council plans, which can be health and wellbeing plans, there can be economic development plans, there can be environmental plans. You can have a look at that information and use some of that information to help justify the need for your project, because you are talking about a geographic area which happens to be the same geographic area as the council grant. So use that data. That's a good place to get some really good data. A strategic and an action plan will have a consultation process both in the inputs, but also there's a consultation process likely to be coming after the plan. How do you turn the plan into action? And if it's a government department, there will be some consultation with the general community or marketplace. And that from that will come the whole process for the grants. The action plan, strategic plan will have those goals, and those goals are what you need to be tuning into. So at the higher level, you've got the policy and or strategic and action plan. Then the financial instruments are what turns those lofty ideas and those target results into actual feasible activities. Those financial instruments, as we mentioned, are the funder's contribution to the process, but they're reliant on the resources on the ground. Which are the applicants for the grants? Well, it's grants. It could be tenders, or especially in the business sector, it might not be a grant so much as a low interest loan. Well, you've got a great concept, a great idea. Here are the first 4 things you should do before you go any further. First of all, check the guidelines for these 4 areas. 1. Aims, objectives and outcomes. It doesn't matter what you want to do as long as you can match the aims, objectives and outcomes of the funder. And these might be identified, especially in the government funding area, aligned to a strategic policy, a plan, some kind of information that will be highlighted. It would be a very good idea to read that information. You'll get a gist for the language and the priorities and the results that the funder is looking for. So always look, see if you can find any evidence. Sometimes it's hidden, of aims, objectives, but most of the time, in fact all of the time, there should be an indicator of the outcomes that they are looking for. So you're matching the aims, objectives and or outcomes. The next thing you should do in the guidelines, again, is to look for who is eligible to apply. Because number 1 rule here is if your organisation type is not on that list, you are not eligible. Sometimes there may be a bit of confusion, and in that case, check with the funder. Because you don't want to be wasting your time starting to put an application together, or indeed completing an application, submitting it, and then finding that it's not even been assessed because you did not pass the threshold criteria of being an eligible organisation. And then of course you need to be looking at, is what we want to spend the money on eligible, the eligible project, the eligible activity. So look at the eligible expenditure. You may be looking for something that requires staffing costs, for example, and the funding grant may say we will not pay for staffing costs. Finally, in this quadrant of things you should look for, Look, if at all possible, find out what the total pool is, the total amount of funding available. It's one thing to know how much you can apply for, up to blah blah blah, but then have a look at what is in the total pot. Because sometimes, especially in an overcrowded space, the funders will attract a lot of applications, but the total amount of funding available is only quite minute. So there's either going to be a lot of disappointed applicants who've put time and effort into something that's competitive to the point of only a certain percentage, a small percentage get funded, very small percentage. And the other issue is that sometimes funders want to spread the money as far as possible. So they will fund as many applications as possible, but they will only give them part funding. And if that happens to be you, it means that you have an issue in terms of, okay, so how do we deliver this project? You'll need to cut it back, or you can only do certain parts of it, get to stage 2 instead of stage 3 and 4, which is why it's also a good idea when you're putting your application together and you're putting the project plan together to actually break that project plan down into stages, so that if you only get part funded, you know that you can go to stage 2, but not stage 3 or 4. So these are the 4 areas that you should look at before you start putting pen to paper, so to speak. At the front of every application form is what we call the administrivia. That's all the administration information that they're looking for in respect to your organisation. For example, all the entities have to be legal entities that the funder will be entering into a contract with. Therefore, in Australia in particular, there'll be an ABN, an Australian business number. Wherever you are, there'll be some kind of business registration number. Secondly, if you're a not-for-profit, you may have an incorporation number. Or if you're a for-profit or a public limited company, you may have an ACN number. These are numbers that are required. Wouldn't it be so good if that information was available just to transcribe onto the application form? If you're incorporated, then you will have an incorporation certificate, and that will be required to be uploaded most of the time. It does not mean that you go onto the internet and you find a copy of your incorporation. No, that is not it. You have to have a copy of the actual certificate. Same applies with your charity status and also your deductible gift recipient status, if these apply to you. These are for not-for-profits, charities, and those who have got DGR status. Again, it has to be a copy of formal documentation, not some record that's taken off of the internet. Financial statements will most of the time be required for many of the grants. And these statements may be required for up to 3 financial years previous to the year that you are applying for the funding. Financial statements are in the form of profit and loss and your annual report, and also the balance sheet. If you've got that information, make sure that you've got it available. The issue you may have is uploading those statements if the space, the allocation is small. I find it's easy for me it's a long way around, but to print out the financial statements, put them into a copy machine, and then to scan them in, and somehow I can actually scan them into a smaller file size than I were to do if I was to use software to merge them. Just a tip there. Okay, so if you haven't been in business for the required number of years, sometimes they may just want your financial statements for the previous year. But if you're a new organisation, two things you do. One, confirm with the funder that you are still eligible to apply. They may say, especially in the business context, that you should have been or must have been in business for at least 3 years, because it's one of their risk criteria to make sure that you are able to conform to the contractor arrangements and that you're not going to go out of business. Not confirmation, but it reduces the risk. Now, the second thing you could do is you could contact the funder again, and they may say, well, okay, can you send us a statement for the length of time that you have been in business? So if you've been in business for less than 12 months, then you send them the statements that you do have to show them that what you've been doing, to show that you are actually a serious, dedicated business or organisation. The application form will be looking for the address details, both the physical and the postal. Maybe looking for the location of delivery, especially if it's there's a possibility that it could be in a separate space altogether. But they will also be looking for two main contacts and their details and their job titles. One of those contacts will be the key person for conversations around the project and itself, the day-to-day contact. And then there'll also be the head of the organisation or somebody representing the organisation at the top level, because the contract is between the board, committee, senior management, or whatever you are, and the entity itself. Again, at the senior level, it's governance. So make sure that one of your contacts is actually authorised to make decisions, or to make decisions that could be ratified, of course, at that higher level. If you're an organisation that's not eligible, but you can work with somebody who is, you may be not a legal entity, is what I should be saying, then you can be auspiced by an organisation that is eligible and is a legal entity. If you're putting an application together as an organisation that's being auspiced, you will be required to put in the information of the auspice organisation, and yes, it will be that same information. The auspice organisation's accounts will be required, their senior level, their project manager, but they may also be required to put in your organisation contacts as well. But this is just to reiterate that the main information on the left-hand column there will be required for the organisation that is auspicing you to submit. You may be asked, if you're not-for-profit, for example, the number of members you have. If you're a business, maybe looking for the number of staff you have, as well as not-for-profits, of course, the number of volunteers, the number of users, any kind of data like that they may be asking for. Letters of support. This is really important. This is actually later on in the document, as is quotes and as is permits and other documents. But it's something that you should be thinking about and planning right at the beginning of the process, because you've only got a limited amount of time to get that information together. Now, if you're looking for letters of support, and there's also what I call letters of intent. Letters of support come from the community, from your clients, from your marketplace, and they're basically there to confirm that there is a need. So there might be some that have got their own story to tell. They may be there to say, look, these people are really great, they've helped us out. Not just to say, look, this is a really good organisation. What really will pack the punch is that lived in experience. So if you are the target market, or you are from the community that's relevant to the application, give some information, story, data, something I remember doing recently putting an application together. There was 28 pages of letters of support, and most of those pages actually contained stories of what happened in a bushfire emergency. It was a bushfire emergency grant, but it was lots of quality data in there that helped to give weight to the story of the application that couldn't be put in the application because of word limits. So again, use your letters of support to be able to tell some of the story that you don't have the space to tell in the application itself. And if that information is given by a third party, that's a strong endorsement. You may be required to put letters of intent in from partners. Now, the reason I say intent is because over many years working in a funding position and also working with projects with partners, it was very difficult for some partners to actually sign a memorandum of understanding, which was required by the funders at the time, to say that we're going to do this, because for sometimes these would have to go through formal processes within the project partners themselves to be approved at the highest level. That would take time. But a letter of intent would say that this is what we want, this is what we're intending to do to get, if this project is funding, we're going to be part of this, and this is what we are going to do. Not a letter of support that's quite wishy-washy and saying we support these and etc. The funder wants to see exactly what the partner organisations are bringing to the table. And I don't mean the meeting table and that's it. It means the skills, the staff, the commitment, the finances, whatever it takes. What value add are they bringing? What gaps are they filling that the organisation can't do on their own in their own right? This kind of information is there. Also, when it comes to the organisation itself, there may be a requirement from the top of the organisation, a letter or a pro forma stating that the organisation supports the application. It's been seen so many times, especially in large organisations with multiple departments, where people have put in applications for grants, been successful, and then the top of the organisation has said, "What is this?" And they've not signed the funding agreement because they were not made aware of this in the first place. So again, this reduces the risk if the organisation is required to complete a pro forma at the highest level, saying, yes, we are aware of this and we support this. Quotes is another one. Make sure that you can get the most up-to-date quotes possible. Don't leave them, show them to be 12, 18 months ago. Try and get them more up-to-date than that when you possibly can. And also try and get formal quotes for your projects, etc. Permits and other documents is another piece of administrivia, especially when it comes for infrastructure grants, because in many cases funders want the infrastructure grants to be shovel ready, and to be shovel ready means that there has to have been some amount of pre-planning and operational stuff happening. It could go 2-3 years previous, even up to four or five max. But you may be, the process of applying for planning permits, land use, permission from landlords if you don't own the property or the land, other kinds of documents that are specifically required that may take some time, may take some process to get to that particular point. So all of this information, especially if you're talking about infrastructure, needs to be prepared in advance where possible so that the information is ready to go before the deadline of the application. So we're now ready to apply for a grant. In the next unit, we will look at writing a compelling grant application.